Okay, so I'm going to dive into this one. So the master bus processing is on. I'm going to get to that. I'm going to start with the guitars. Now this is different to any of the other videos I've done, or most of the other videos I've done so far, in that I'm just using a left and right guitar, not quad tracked, and I'm using a different rig on each side of the mix, but still in the world of plugins. So the first one, I've got STO Ignite. I'm using the 5153 EVH on this channel here, so gain, low end, mid, high end, presence for that channel, and these controls, the presence, are for the presence on these two channels over here. So up first, maxing, pretty standard OD 808 settings for me. Those are the amp settings, and the cabinet I am using, so 100% on this side, so we're using cab 5, top right speaker, position 3, so that is the Marshall speaker from my impulse response pack, which is a vintage 30 speaker. So if I put that guitar on mono, we can have a listen to it. Cool. So that's how it sounds, but actually it's got some EQ on the channel. I'll get to that in a minute. So this is how it sounds without the EQ. It's going to be quite different. And I'll turn the EQ off the guitar bus. So this is how that tone sounds, completely raw now. Cool, so let's look at this EQ. It's going to be very detailed. So the first round of EQing that I do on my guitar tones is always subtractive. It's finding problematic areas that I want to reduce. And when I've gone through a tone and removed everything that I personally find problematic, then the fun part is kind of boosting things back in that you want to hear in the mix and bring the life back in to the guitar tone. So first we're doing some sort of like multi-band compression with some dynamic EQ in the low end on the palm mutes. So I'm carving it out, and it's kind of dynamic in the sense that it's responding to what's being fed into it. Up next, this is a problematic kind of whistly frequency on that you find on all cabs really. Then just carving out a little bit of this harsh nasally sort of upper mids. And then this is where usually you get all sorts of whistling going on. So 2.1, 2.3 is kind of standard for me to get rid of. And up next, 2.8. And then 3.2, which is usually on every speaker that I do, I end up tackling that area. And 4.1, 4.3 around there. 4.7 on this one. And then kind of cutting out a bunch of 7K. A little bit wider there, so I'm on a bell of 36. Because I wanted a lot of presence from the amp, but I don't like hearing too much between 6 and 7K. Cool, so that is that setup. Then on the other side of the mix, I'm just going to put that back to where it was. I didn't hard pan these, so I'm panning to 94% left and right. So on the other side of the mix, I'll put it back in the center. Going to turn the EQ off, and we're using Ignite again. I think similar, if not the same settings, but this time I'm using cab 3, bottom left speaker, and that is an SM57. And this cab is one of the smaller Mesa Boogie cabinets, more of like a traditional Marshall size. So I don't know if that's the stiletto cab or the trad flat fronted cab, but this is one of the ones exclusive to my impulse response pack, and that's going to be a vintage 30 from the year 2000 as well, I think. So that's how it sounds without any EQ. I can already hear that there's quite an annoying like frequency in the mid-range that I will have notched out, so let's look at the EQ for this one. Very similar sort of stuff going on. and that's the frequency that I always hear on EQ'd guitars. And then slightly different, because all of this stuff that I'm doing here is specific to every different speaker. So no vintage 30 is going to have the exact same characteristic in the high end. There are a lot of areas that I find come up commonly with speakers when I'm like notching out these frequencies, like 2.3, 2.9, 3.2, all that kind of stuff. But don't just copy what I'm doing here, because this is different to the other EQ that I just showed you. So it's the sort of thing that you have to kind of find for yourself. But if you have something like Pro Q3 that has a really good frequency analyzer on it, you can see these areas as well. They'll just kind of rear their head and you'll actually be able to see where the problems are. And I'd probably get a bit of that down. And again, what we're removing here is 6.6. It's the same guitar amp on each side, but two different speakers. One's a Marshall, one's a Mesa Boogie. Then if we get on the guitar bus, got the C4 multiband compressor. Can't ever have too much of that. And then I'm doing some boosting with the SSL console. So I'm boosting up at like 16k essentially, but it's more that it's going to be bringing up, you're going to be hearing it bring up more around like 10k. But I just wanted to get it away from bringing up too much 6k. So it's not that I'm necessarily looking to bring up 16k, it's just that this is like a wide bell, and the further away I can get it from the 6k area, it's not going to have much 16k, because I will have tackled that again with some low and high pass filtering after this plugin. Up next, 3.3, I'm boosting it by 3.3 dB. And then subtracting some mids, as you will have seen in any of the other videos I've done with this plugin. For some reason, I guess because they're modeling off of maybe a specific channel strip, specifically just this one band does not correspond with the value that it says it does. So it says 1k, but I think it's somewhere a bit higher up that I'm removing. Or lower, I can't remember which way it's off, but it's not too accurate for some reason. And then, I mean, that's pretty much like barely noticeable. Just bringing up some low in there. Okay, so more taming of anything shrill. I think it's kind of dangerous using Soothe on guitars, but everyone's doing it now, so I figured I'd give it a try. And for guitars, I'd bring the sharpness up a bit to help kind of tackle some of that kind of harsh frequency in the top end. And it's really easy to overdo it, so yeah, I try and not overdo Soothe on my guitars. Just helps tame anything a bit too nasty up there. Up next, EQ. So this is on the entire guitar bus, some more problematic areas in the top end. So as I said, you know what, I never do this, but admittedly I was referring to a tone that was super dark in terms of anything above like 8k. So even though I was bringing up 16k on the SSL strip, I've just then taken most of it out. But it was worth doing in my eyes, but yeah, it's not so much that I was wanting to hear 16k. As I said, I was just wanting to bring up, because you're sort of limited on this plugin with the areas that you're boosting. And admittedly, yeah, I don't need to use a plugin like this. I could just do everything with a bunch of instances of Pro Q3. There's no specific reason why I would go for the SSL console, but it does do that similar thing of the Korn F1 where it can like emulate an analog board and give you a slightly different stereo image, but obviously I'm using two different tones here. So again, This is an area that I love to get rid of, nasally mid-range. Instantly makes your guitar sound like thin and annoying. This is more, not necessarily that this was a problematic frequency, I was referencing a tone that just had a ton of this taken out. So that is not something that I felt was necessarily necessary for this tone, but it was necessary because I was A-Bing against a guitar tone that I like. And then just kind of doing things as I go in the mix just to, I mean, this is always an area that I don't like hearing too much of. Almost 6K. Getting rid of that just instantly makes your guitar sound thicker and darker. And then again, more EQ, more subtle moves. So when you look at this kind of like final tone, that's usually where my high end is like coming through the loudest in this area, and that's why I tackle it so much up front and remove like anything that's too harsh and piercing, because then I end up boosting it louder in the mix without boosting up all that harshness. So pretty involved on this one. Now, you'll have seen in a lot of my videos that I've done really heavy-handed EQing on guitars, and that is something that I do a lot. But you can get really good results, and I'm also confident in my own ability to get good results with really minimal, broad, basic moves. And I'll deliberately go out of my way to do some more broad EQ moves in the future on some mixes where it's not like a million instances of Pro Q3 and notching everywhere. I don't want people to think that you can only get good guitar tones by going crazy, notching every problematic frequency out. There's all kinds of different ways, but you know, obviously making sure your source tone is void of as many of those problematic areas is great, and just being able to kind of cleverly use broader moves with your EQ to take your ear away from any of those problematic frequencies is still completely viable. And yeah, as I said, I'll aim to do something like that in the future. Up next, we'll look at the bass. Using Umansky bass again, humanize, position. I just like the sound of the thicker tone you get of playing notes higher up the fretboard as opposed to the sort of thinner sound in the higher strings on the lower, or what I would describe as the lower frets. So that's why I've done that. Then we can look at the bass tone on its own. So Pro and beat up first, really trying to hold down the low end, keep it really consistent. And then doing some EQing here with Pro Q3. Dark Glass Ultra, got quite a lot of the DI tone coming through there. And then more EQ, this is a lot more involved. Dynamic EQ here on the low end. Removing a lot of mids that I don't really want or I didn't want for this tone. Not necessarily a problem area, like leaving a lot of mids in your bass tone can sound really cool. I definitely like hearing a bit more of this area, like around 700 to come through, to like cut through the guitars in a mix. This kind of area, 1.7 is normally a bit of a problem for me. Definitely whistling a bit. Low and high pass filtering, and then limiting, which is pretty common for me on bass. That's as extreme as I'd want to go for gain reduction with the limiter, because the more you do limiting wise, the more kind of I feel it kills the low end and kind of removes a lot of that sub. And then more EQ again. Actually letting a bit more of the high end come through than the low end here in the mix. So I don't always stick to the rule of my low end and high end peaking at around the same point. And that is the bass. So up next, the drums. I've got Pro Q3, but it's not doing anything, so I can turn that off. I normally just like to look at things on Pro Q3 when I'm mixing. And let's look at the kit that we've got going on here. And it's the Yamaha 24-inch kick with the Evans head, which is what the E corresponds to, Evans or Remo. And this is how it sounds. And then let's check out the snare using the Gretsch bell brass in the lower tuning. It's not necessarily a low tuning, but it's the lowest of the three Gretsch bell brass sounds. And if you don't have Ultimate Heavy Drums yet, although this is the same snare in different tunings, they're all processed completely differently. It's not just like the same sound, higher and lower. I wanted everything to sound unique and distinctive and approach the processing completely different on all of them. So even though there's the same drum here, processed it differently to offer more scope and as much variety in the pack as possible. Using a fair bit of the overhead mic here. I brought the pitch down a little bit here, -1. Quite a lot of reverb, really wet sounding there. It's on 43%. So yeah, snares up 1.6. The overhead's up 4.8. The overhead mic's definitely not as loud as the close mic, so it's not like it's louder than the close mics. But even though the fader is louder, room mic has been pulled down a bit, -5.6. Toms, all the Yamaha ones pretty much standard, no EQ on them. Overheads are -2.6 for the toms and -5 on the rooms. Cymbals, pulled the hi-hat down a little bit. Overheads, yeah, I think I brought the China down a little bit there. The crashes, so this is the only way you can change the level of the crashes is in the overhead mixer. The reason being because in the world of real drums, when you mic up a drum kit, you have two overhead mics, a left and a right above the kit, and they are picking up the whole big picture of the kit, but mostly for me and for most metal audio engineers and mixers, you're picking up the crashes. So overhead mics to me are essentially the crash mics, and then all the other smaller mics you typically use spot mics for. So Chinas, your hi-hats, ride, splashes. So that's why the overhead or the crash cymbals aren't in this cymbal mixer, because they are only part of the overhead mics, which is standard practice. But maybe somewhat confusing, because I did have one person ask why they couldn't change the level of the crashes in this, and they may have overlooked this little overhead mixer here. So this is where you can change the level of the crashes. You get complete control over them independently, obviously, in the pan, the tilt EQ on each cymbal. So you can have full control over them. But also the overhead mics, which are mostly for me picking up the crashes, you can still adjust the level of the close mics in the overheads, and then have the close mics on some of those cymbals you can have a bit more control of with this mixer. And then there's the room mics here, the cymbals in the room mics, down at -4.9. Already looked at the pitch, so snare came down a bit, reverb just on the snare and the toms, and that is it for the drum mix. So this is how it all sounds. And let's take a look at the master bus processing. So just for the sake of this video, this is my master bus fader. I've gone down nearly 2 dB just for the sake of my outputting and my voice mic as I do this video. So the first bit of EQ, I mean, that's barely doing anything there. Up 0.3 from 4K upwards, high shelf, and then removing below 40. There's not a lot going down there anyway. So if I turn that EQ on and off, there's not a lot of difference. And I used the solid bus comp from Native Instruments. Ratio 3, attack 30, release the quickest, 0.1. Just a few dB of gain reduction. Then up next, flat line. This is a clipper, so it's just clipping mostly the snare hits, but also like drums, kicks in general. Shape is at 96. And then lastly, Pro L. And that is it for the entire mix of that one. If you haven't picked up a copy of Ultimate Heavy Drums just yet, definitely check it out. It's incredibly versatile and it has replaced all drums for me from this point on, so I'm very, very happy with it.